Hello, everyone. All right, I think we're going to get started right here. So my name is Jonathan Silva. I'm joined here by Brett Goldman, who will be my wingman for today. And we're going to get started with the Scrum webinar, so Scrum Essentials. A few housekeeping items just before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. So if you have associates who want to listen to the webinar later, or perhaps if you want to share this with anyone, we'll go ahead and either send you the link to the YouTube page, or you'll just get a follow-up email from us again. And then also, this webinar is for anyone who's new to Scrum. So if you already have a pretty fantastic understanding of what Scrum is, this will serve as a great refresher. But this is really more geared towards people who are either their stakeholders in their team, or they're just getting started with the whole framework. So I just want to make sure we set that expectation. And aside from that, in terms of questions, so if at any time during the webinar you'd like to pose a question, go ahead and you'll see in the GoToWebinar control panel section where you can expand for questions. So feel free to ask any questions. Brett will be answering them throughout the presentation. And then towards the end, if there are any questions that have not already been answered during the webinar itself, we'll go ahead and set aside about 10-15 minutes towards the end of the hour to answer those questions. All right, today's agenda, we're going to talk about really briefly where Scrum comes from in terms of what is Agile in the Agile Manifesto. And then we'll get into Scrum activities, Scrum roles, who's who, and we'll go through what a Scrum cycle looks like, a sprint cycle. And then towards the very end, we're going to demo for anyone who is a current user of Axosoft. We are going to show you a feature that we plan to release pretty soon. It's a daily Scrum feature, just as a little treat. It'll just be a few minutes. And then towards the end, I also wanted to address some of the main questions that we get. What does a Scrum Master do all day? And it's a common question that we often receive. And I just want to provide a few explanations and try to kind of shed some light on that. Okay, and with that, we'll go ahead and get going. As you may see, I'm on a Prezi, and depending on your internet connection and how willing GoToWebinar is to work with us here, the transitions may be a little choppy, and I just ask for your patience. In the recording, though, it will look fantastic, so just as a heads up. And with that, we'll get going. So I want to start with a story. When I initially got my Scrum certification, my trainer laid this fact on us, that 80% of teams who attempt to implement Scrum fail. And if you really think about this, it actually applies to any sort of organizational change, any change that maybe you have done, it, whether it be some New Year's resolution or some habit that you've been trying to alter. And organizations are essentially creatures of habits. And you can never really destroy a habit. You can only change the behavior that happens in between the reward and the cue that initiates the whole habit loop. And so I just want to set that expectation that even if you go to a Scrum training, even after this webinar, and you feel like you have a better understanding of Scrum, we don't recommend trying to change everything overnight. You'll get eaten alive. It won't work out. And we instead recommend taking bits and pieces of the ideas that we present today, and bits and pieces of ideas that you continue to learn, and try to bring it into your organization if it's not already alive and well in your organization. So it's just an expectation I want to set. We're not too worried about doing Scrum a specific way. There's no one right way to do Scrum. It's a framework. In many ways, there's different ways that you can apply it. And because every team, because every organization is different, unique, it has its own circumstances, its own people, there's always going to be a different way of applying it. While you can find similar ways of solving certain problems that you might have, Scrum is just kind of a cookbook that helps you figure out, well, how can we solve our own problems? So Scrum is actually part of Agile, the Agile being an umbrella term for a group of other software development methods. And these developments, you may have heard of Kanban, this lean software development, feature-driven development. There's a whole host of them, but they all have the same themes. The theme of having iterative and incremental development. The theme of having collaborating, self-organizing, and cross-functional teams. And so this is the idea, this is where Scrum came together. Agile was actually put together, the Agile Manifesto was a group of gentlemen who got together at a resort, and they actually talked about the problems that they've been facing in developing software. Now, while Agile was initially developed for software development, it has been adapted to situations outside of software development, maybe design. We here at Axosoft, I mean, I've talked to someone who's tried to apply Scrum to his kitchen. He's a chef. So there's different ways that you can apply Scrum. You might take the best, you adapt it to what works for you. And so I just wanted to review the Agile Manifesto before we dive into what Scrum really is. And it starts off with these 4 principles. The first one being individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So a key feature here, that a key word, over. This does not mean that processes and tools and comprehensive documentation are not important. That's not what it's trying to communicate. The idea is that you should always try to promote individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Don't let the process, don't let the overhead get in the way of people actually talking to one another, of individuals actually being able to express their ideas. In Scrum, in particular, in Agile, it's all about the team, and you want to develop the trust in a team, so that the team is able to trust each and every other team member, and that the organization is able to trust in their ability to, be accountable for their actions. Yes, certain failures may occur, but in the end, it's about developing a high-performing team, and you can't do that without developing trust first. The second one is working software over comprehensive documentation. The whole point of Scrum, the whole point of this is to get software or your product, whatever you're using Agile to do, whatever your environment may be, to get software out the door. That's the whole point. And so you shouldn't let overhead get in the way. It's important to have documentation just so you can understand what your code is in using the software example. But really, if you're not getting software out the door, then you're not really producing any value for your customer. And then the last 2, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. This in Scrum will refer to a particular role called the product owner, and the product owner will be the person who evaluates the business value of all the feature requests, and we'll get into that in a moment, that the customer is expecting. So there's this one role in Scrum who does the who collaborates with the customer and makes sure that there is feedback getting into the developers. And of course, being able to respond to change rather than just following a plan. Having a plan is important because it sets the direction for where you want to go. You need to have an idea of, well, which way are we going? But oftentimes, especially I've seen this in waterfall teams, that they'll have all the analysis, everything up front, but at the beginning of the project is a time when you have the worst information, you have the least amount of feedback, the least amount of data, and to stick to a plan that was conceived at the moment when you had the worst information just makes no sense. And so the idea here is that as information comes in, as the scope changes, you are adapting and you are making adjustments. Otherwise, otherwise you're just doomed to have lots of difficulties. Now, I wanted to just kind of stop for a moment and have just a little brief tangent here. Going back to customer collaboration, we here at Axosoft, we recently were introduced to the idea of support-driven development. And this is, if you want to check it out, it's Kevin Hale. He's the founder of Wufoo, if you want to go on YouTube. And his presentation is called How to Design Software Users Love. And he talks about how developers sometimes become divorced from the customer, that they don't really understand how what they're developing is being implemented, has been used by the people they made it for. And so he's a strong proponent of the idea of letting everyone do support at some point. And he recommends just 2 hours of support every 6 weeks for each developer. And it's a really small time commitment, but it's enough time to allow the developer to understand, oh, this is how they're using it. And then you get development that has a user in mind from the beginning, that has support in mind. And it just begins to create this positive loop. And so if you want to check it out, Kevin Hale, founder of Wufoo, it's a half-hour presentation, but it's we really enjoyed it, and we're currently implementing a lot of the principles that we learned from it here at the company. Okay, so that being said, we covered Agile, the Agile Manifesto, but what in the world is Scrum? So perhaps some of you, since a lot of the folks here are subscribers to our newsletter, you probably may have seen the Scrum Under 10 Minutes video. And if that's the case, then you've probably seen this diagram. If not, This diagram will make a little bit more sense as we continue. Once the webinar is over, this diagram will make a little bit more sense. But we want to dive into more detail that, 10 minutes is, quite not enough to cover a lot of what we're going to talk about, and also give you the opportunity to ask questions that we'll get to towards the end of the session. So we're going to start with the Scrum process. And everything starts with a particular artifact. So an artifact just being a fancy word for just something that you deal with in the process. And the first and most important thing about Scrum is the product backlog. So the product backlog is a wish list of all the items that you want incorporated into your product, I mean. And so these are feature requests that you get from customers. These are ideas that you have yourself, that your team has come up with, things that you know can make your product really amazing, really successful, and very valuable to your customer. And so you're compiling this wish list, and you're trying to make sense of it. And so one approach that people take in putting their product backlog together is the idea of the user story. So you may have heard of the user story. It's an approach. You don't have to use user stories in order to do Scrum. There's actually a lot of buzzwords that people hear that aren't necessarily part of the framework of Scrum. In many ways, they are approaches. So some of these other buzzwords are epics or themes. And while they are frequently associated with Scrum, they are approaches to Scrum. You don't necessarily have to do it that way. You can come up with your own approach. You can adapt it to your own process. What I'm going to introduce you to, guys, is the main Scrum activities, the things that make up, well, this is how it goes. And there's other pieces that you have to discover for yourself. Questions that only you can answer because you have the best idea of how your team works, of what your environment is, and what your industry requires. But anyway, getting back to the user story, it's in the form of, as a support agent, I want to chat with customers so that I can provide an excellent customer experience. So it's just a way of framing what the user story is. And when the product owner, and we'll get to the product owner in a moment, but when this individual goes through the product backlog, they add the pertinent details. So they're getting feedback from customers. They're talking to their team, getting an idea of, well, what kind of development would this take? Just a preliminary idea. And eventually this becomes a ranked list of all the items, all the items in your wish list. And so you have all these items in this library of product backlog items. Now the issue becomes, well, what do we get started? What do we work on first? We need to break this down into something that's actually more manageable. And so that's the idea of breaking it down by releases. So this is an extra credits step. When I initially took the training, they jumped straight into sprint planning. And I had a conversation with the trainers, like, can you have release planning too? And he said, yes, of course. And so this is what we do. We approach software development in versions. So right now we're in V14.2, and we plan for that release. And so essentially what occurs is we have this huge backlog of product backlog items, and we decide what is going to make it into the release backlog. So essentially what's going to be the work that we do during the next quarter, since we do quarterly releases. And once we decide what items make it into the release backlog, you have something called the sprint planning meeting. So this is one of the fundamental Scrum activities. So you have sprint planning meeting. Rule of thumb, for every week that you have planned for the sprints, you typically have 1 hour of sprint planning with your team. And this includes the entire Scrum team. And I'll introduce those folks in a moment. But during the sprint planning, you're trying to answer two questions. What will be done in this sprint, and how are we going to do it? And so that typically involves a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, and it's important to hammer out those details. Nothing should go into the sprint backlog that is not fully defined. If you don't have an idea of what the definition of done is, then that product backlog item should not go into the sprints. Otherwise, you have no idea how to measure when it's actually completed. And so during the sprint planning meeting, you're going to have something that we call the sprint goal, which is essentially your definition of done. So if I'm that support agent, if I want to go back to that support user story example, my definition of done is that I'm able to chat with a customer and provide, and how do I define provide a good experience? And the response time is less than 0.2 milliseconds. So some parameter, something that we can actually measure, something that we actually develop against. And again, if you're not in software development, you can adapt it to your own environment, your own industry, whatever you have to be in. Okay, so those are the first handful of activities. That's all in the beginning of a sprint. So all of that is happening before you actually get going with the sprint. But who is who in the Scrum team? So who's who? So that's a little bit of a roller coaster right there. So we're going to get started with the Scrum team. And the Scrum team is comprised of three major roles. This is your cast. You have the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the development team. And typically, the size of a Scrum team is anywhere between 7 plus or minus 2 people. Now, where do executives fall in? Where do stakeholders fall in? Managers, are they part of the Scrum team? No, they're not really part of the Scrum team necessarily. They are important. Their feedback is necessary, but the Scrum team, they're the ones who are focusing on actually completing the work, on actually meeting the sprint goal. When it comes to executives or managers, we need them in order to approve certain things. So if we need more servers, we need to approach management about that. If we want to get feedback from our customers, then we're going to need our stakeholders, our customers. And so the Scrum team will interact with those folks. But they're not part of the actual development process. And so we're going to start with a product owner. And the product owner is the individual I mentioned earlier. So this is the individual who is most responsible for the product backlog. That is their primary duty, to collect all the feature requests, to collect all the product backlog items, and try to make sense of them. Try to rank them based off business value, and which product backlog items would provide the most value to my customer. And so they are collecting data, they are interacting with customers, they are talking to the dev team, getting help from the Scrum Master, anything and anything to get as much detail as possible into the product backlog. In Scrum, I guess this is the only role that has a single ringable nick, so that for some reason, if anything does go wrong, typically people like to blame the product owner because they're the ones who decided what goes into the sprint, or they played a heavy role. I wouldn't want to, don't worry about blaming people. It's more about working together as a team, building that trust, and learning from any mistakes that are made. In many ways, getting that feedback, finding out that, that feature was actually not really important, is just as valuable, and you would not have found out without actually doing it. And so always try to iterate and learn from the mistakes. So that's a product owner. Next role is the Scrum Master. So the Scrum Master is the Scrum resource, the individual on your team who knows just about everything that needs to be known about Scrum. So the process, how to remove impediments. They essentially are your servant leader. Some people ask, well, who would make a great Scrum Master? And people ask, well, what about my project manager? And typically the reason why project managers don't transition very well into a Scrum Master is a lot of project managers come from some semblance of command and control. So they tell people what to do. And the Scrum Master does the opposite. They guide people. They let the team fail even if that's where they're headed. The whole point, the Scrum Master's goal is to get the team to a high-performing state. And they're doing that by coaching the team itself, the product owner. It's their job to just help them understand how to solve their own problems. And so towards the end of the presentation, I'll jump into a little bit more detail about the Scrum Master, about what their goal really is, and how they might be able to get the team to high-performing. It's a little nebulous. And I'll also answer the question, well, do we even need a Scrum Master? So that's a question we get a lot too. And so I'll get towards that towards the end, just to kind of pique your interest. And then the development team. So this is the rest of the team. So these are your developers, your testers. If you're not in software development, this is the rest of your team members, the people who are responsible for producing the sprint goal for whatever increment that you're using to measure. They're the ones who are responsible for actually getting the work done. So those are the three team members. You have the Scrum Master, the product owner, and the dev team. So we already talked about the product backlog. We talked about how the product owner organizes it's in an activity called backlog refinement or backlog grooming. And they also have a sprint planning meeting or a release planning meeting. So they've decided what's going to make it into the sprint. So the sprint gets started then. What happens during the sprint? So every day you're going to have this activity called the daily stand-up. And during the daily stand-up, and this will involve the Scrum Master, the product owner, and the rest of the dev team. and they're going to answer these three major questions. What did I do yesterday? This is what I've done since we last met. What are some problems that I've encountered? And this is what I plan to do today. And the whole point of this is to, inject communication at the very beginning of the day, if you choose to have it in the beginning of the day. But you're trying to, first of all, everyone is getting an idea of what everyone is responsible for, what problems they're encountering. And it also gives everyone the opportunity to solve problems, collaborate, and get an idea for like, okay, this is what the day is going to look like. Any problems that typically involve a longer discussion are taken offline. But this is an integral part of Scrum. So in terms of what the Scrum Master is doing, a lot of the work is done at the front end. You front load a lot of the work, and then the rest of the sprint, the Scrum Master will be facilitating the daily Scrum, but they'll also be responsible for coaching and helping the product owner and also removing impediments during the sprints. So the sprint is over. You managed to get as much work as humanly possible during your sprint. Let me back up a bit. A sprint typically lasts anywhere between 2 to 30 days. The most common time box for a sprint is 2 weeks. And then the time box for a daily Scrum is 15 minutes. So that's just a rule of thumb. You don't have to necessarily go with that. But that's any sprint that goes longer than 30 days is a little bit more difficult to manage, because it's just people lose that ability to hold themselves accountable. If you have a shorter time frame, the deadline's a little bit tighter. It promotes a lot better focus. So before you have your sprint retrospective, there's another Scrum activity. It's called a sprint. It's basically a demo. It's a sprint review. That's the activity. And it's basically a demo where you demonstrate what was completed during the sprint. And so typically what our team does here is, they all get together in the room and they have a projector and they show, well, this is what was completed, this is how it works, these are some things that we've noticed. And you basically go through, typically the stakeholders are present, the executives, and you kind of go through and demonstrate what has happened. If sometimes we have Scrum teams who don't produce anything, perhaps that was their first sprint, and you have the sprint review essentially becomes a sprint retrospective. And during the sprint retrospective, you essentially you decide, well, what went right, what went wrong, and how can we improve for the next round. So this is an important Scrum activity. This is where the whole idea of iteration, of incremental improvement comes into play. So you're learning from your mistakes. Your first sprint, this is the first time you're doing Scrum, is probably not going to go very well, just because you're in the process of learning. You're in the process of barely getting buy-in from your team. And so it's important to continue this process, to make things better, to improve, and not to break the concentration of the team. All right, give me a moment here. So I'm going to go through, so this is what a sprint cycle will look like from beginning to end. So before the sprint even begins, you start with your product backlog, and you're managing all your product backlog items, mainly through the product owner. The product owner will rank all the items, add detail, collect feedback from customers and the team itself. Once the backlog has been ranked and you're ready to start your release or your sprint, you have the planning meetings. And that's when you decide what will get done and how it will get done. Remember, release planning meetings and sprint planning meetings in particular, usually last an hour for each week in the sprint. And then during the sprint, you have the activity called the daily stand-up, which lasts around 15 minutes, usually in the morning, and you go all around and try to find out what was done yesterday, what am I doing today, what problems am I having. I almost forgot to show the Scrum feature that we're talking about here. So you're having your daily Scrum, and we decided to introduce a feature that facilitates the daily Scrum for teams who use Axosoft. So if I click on the daily Scrum feature here, I got 4 team members who are currently on sprint 3, and we have a timer here that can begin the daily Scrum, but essentially you go through each individual. So right now we're starting with Kathy, and you see the work that she's done so far. And you have a high level view of how each person is doing. And once that person is done talking about what they did yesterday, what they're doing today, and what problems they've encountered, you can just move to the next folks. So here we can either go to David or to Rolf. If you guys are all in a circle, you can decide which way you want to go. And so here we have David, and the same information, you're able to represent that information really quickly here. So we just wanted to show that Scrum feature. This is going to be out in our next release. We're really excited to show it to you guys. It's something that our developers here, since they developed it, they really want to have the daily Scrum up on the projector. And so it's something that's come in handy. It's very visual. It gets the point across really quickly rather than just verbally saying things. So it's great for visual and experiential learners. Once the sprint is over, you have the sprint review where you demo what was actually completed, and then you jump into the sprint retrospective where you try to understand what happened during the sprint in an effort to improve, to iterate, to get better. And so that's the entire Scrum process in a nutshell. There are some finer details that we can always talk about, which we hopefully will introduce in other webinars, but we just want to provide the basics here. And so hopefully this Scrum diagram will make a little bit more sense. And so you'll probably see some things that we didn't really talk about, though, like the burn down chart and estimations. Again, estimations are approaches. You don't necessarily have to do it. And the burn down chart is just another approach for trying to get a good idea of when things will get done. It just happens to be a really popular approach that makes Scrum even more valuable to teams. So I wanted to jump into an extra credit topic here, and the goal of the Scrum Master. So the goal of the Scrum Master, it's not just for them to facilitate the sprint retrospective or the sprint review or any of the other Scrum activities. And while it's great to have someone who understands what the Scrum activities are, that's not their only function. The goal of the Scrum Master is to get the team to to a high-performing state. You want the team to be able to react to changes in scope. You want the team to be able to communicate seamlessly. You want to essentially be able to have a team of people that you can throw anything at and they will respond and perform, that they will take care of essentially all of your issues. It's your dream team. It's the team that will make you money. And so that's the whole point of the Scrum Master, is to get the team to a high-performing state. And so through collaborating with other trainers and other folks who've been Scrum certified, we typically follow something called Tuckman stages of group development. You've probably heard of it before, but I'm just going to reintroduce the idea in terms of Scrum. So it's the idea of forming, storming, norming, performing. And so when it comes to Scrum, in the forming stage, so forming talks about, the team is getting together, routines are being set, no one is really interested in stepping on each other's toes. No one is really interested in starting any conflict. They're just trying to understand, get a gauge for who's who. In other words, size each other up. And Scrum Master should be taking advantage of the stage to make sure that everyone understands what their role is, so that everyone fully understands who the product owner is and what they're supposed to do, that everyone understands what the Scrum Master is supposed to be doing, and also that everyone, as a development team member or as just a general team member, that they understand what their role is as well. Now, once everyone is comfortable with each other, you get to the stage where you get to the storming stage. Some teams get stuck in storming and they never leave it, but this is a place where different ideas begin to compete. So people call them debates. Storming takes if it's conflict that the team needs to go through in order to really move past it. And so the Scrum Master tends to be the referee. And what I always recommend is the Scrum Master should provide a very fair process for having all ideas heard. The best way to make sure that everyone feels that the best idea is being considered is that, first of all, everyone feels understood. So whatever process you use should help everyone feel understood, that their position, that their opinion, that their idea is heard. And then you want to provide a way for everyone to evaluate, well, this is good, this is bad. Something that we always recommend doing is it's an improv technique. You never say but or yes but, because you're essentially negating what someone is saying. It's like, yes, but I'm about to negate everything you just said. You want to do yes and. Or if you are concerned about an idea that someone says, you can always start with, I like that blah, 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 blah. I am concerned that blah, 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 blah. So yes, it might be a little wishy-washy, but it works a lot better because you're trying to build on ideas. You're not trying to tear people down, and it goes much smoother, and you respect people's boundaries. So if you survive storming, you make it into norming. A lot of people end up just staying in norming. In norming, the team has come together around a goal, and they're willing to actually work together to reach that goal. And while they're, okay, everyone's behind Scrum, okay, we're gonna get behind the sprint goal. They're just, they're still uncertain about how to respond to certain things. They're not at a high-performing state yet, mainly because there's a lot of uncertainties. Um, they're still not mature enough yet. And so the norming stage is where the Scrum Master is taking a lot of time coaching the Scrum team. So coaching the product owner, coaching the Scrum team, it's the development team, and also removing impediments. So that's what the majority of the Scrum Master's time will be spent. A lot of their time will be spent, yes, in the front doing, the planning meetings, and then towards the end doing the retrospective. But what are they doing in between? And this is what they're doing. They're helping the team understand how to work better, removing impediments. Once you reach the performing stage, the Scrum Master is still removing impediments and coaching, but the team is essentially able to, manage itself. It's accountable. It has a great understanding of its own limitations, and it's able to communicate those effectively. And they're able to take on. They do Scrum seamlessly. They don't even need a Scrum Master anymore. So when the question comes up, well, do we even need a Scrum Master? If your team is able to get product out the door, if they've adapted Scrum in a way that actually lets the baton get passed from each racer to the next, then you probably don't need a Scrum Master. You probably need a Scrum Master just every once in a while, or you can have what we do here is the Scrum Master rotates. So you have lots of folks here who are Scrum certified, and when it comes to the Scrum meeting or certain Scrum activities, the role of Scrum Master sort of rotates because we've adopted Scrum and we've done it for years, and so we've gotten to the point where we can get product out the door, but we don't necessarily need someone to be removing impediments because we all work together to do that. And so that's the whole point of the Scrum Master, is to get the team to high performing. While it's important for them to remove impediments and coach and just be a Scrum resource, the whole point there should be to get the team to high performing. So that being said, thank you for listening. We're going to start answering questions here. And before we get going, I did want to share a quote. I'm going to paraphrase a lot here, but it talks about the Agile movement being a lot like a teenager. And so they're very self-conscious, checking constantly their appearance in the mirror, they're making sure they're using the right jargon, the right slang, and they're completely ignoring any wisdom from the past. So in many ways, Scrum and Agile is like a teenager, but we have no doubt that it will mature further, become more open to the outside world, more reflective, and also therefore more effective. So in many ways, Scrum is still maturing. We're still learning more about, well, how do I incorporate it in the real world? It's great to have this theory, but how does the implementation really look like? And so these are discussions that I hope to have more webinars about. So thank you all for joining us. We wish you a wonderful Tuesday, and have a great rest of the week.